Well, it turns out that the LGBTQ agenda is a lie. It's based on a falsehood that homosexuals and transgendered people, that they were born this way. Well, now we know better. There's an article recently in the New York Times by a writer named Jane Coaston. She's upset because it seems that as the numbers of LGBTQ identifying people in our country is increasing, people are starting to notice, and she's put out that we're noticing. She seems concerned that we're not against the existence of homosexual and transgendered people, but that we are simply concerned that there are too many of them. In other words, she says we're only worried because they're becoming such a prominent part of our culture. Of course, the whole sudden exponential increase in the number of people identifying with the homosexual agenda and the transgender agenda, the whole rainbow of identities that's now out there, it sort of gives the lie right up front to this mantra that we were born this way. It's now obvious to anybody that pays attention that these identities are not spread by genetic reality, but they are spread by social contagion. In other words, these identities are not innate, they're not immutable, they're not essential aspects of a person's authentic self. In fact, I've given you a reference at the end of this video to an article from Nature magazine in 2019. You were almost certain to have missed it because in that article, an article never widely publicized, Nature magazine summarizes the research in the scientific search for what was colloquially called the gay gene. And what they've concluded now for several years, scientists know this, although the media still portrays the lie. Scientists understand that there is no genetic determinism to sexual desire. In fact, as it turns out, there's no genetic basis for any sexual desire. The development of our sexual desires as human beings is complex, it's often fluid, it's driven by environmental factors and social factors, and it's much more complicated than just being born a certain way. There's no objective test, for example, to determine whether someone is transgender. It's purely a matter of self-identification, and the self-identification is justified on the basis of a rather bizarre metaphysical claim that a person can be, quote, born into the wrong body or go through, quote, the wrong puberty. Theologically, the problem with that is it implies that we have some pre-existent existence, that before we're born into this physical reality, that we somehow exist somewhere else as a gendered spirit. And that it's possible in the grand scheme of things that a gendered spirit can then be encased in the wrong body. Now, biblically speaking, there's all kinds of problems with that because first of all, at its core, without any sexual considerations at all, that very idea is Gnostic. That is, it's anti-Christian, it's unbiblical, because it's the idea that we are just spirits captured in some sort of physical shell, and it's possible for the machinery that pumps out new human beings, that somehow the wrong gendered soul gets matched to the wrong gendered body. Biblically speaking, life begins at conception. It is a specific act, creative act on the part of God. And at that moment, soul and body are created, fused into a single reality, not separate, not a dichotomy of different parts sort of assembled in a laboratory or a workroom. a new being created, there's no chance for mistaken parts being matched together. There's no flap A fitting into the wrong slot B. That's not how creation works. And so what's at stake here, this idea that I'm in the wrong body, that I'm experiencing the wrong puberty, what it's done is it has created a climate in our culture that has produced some cultural and legal victories for the LGBTQ movement that have been built on this falsehood that I'm born this way. But recognizing the reality that there is now no scientific evidence whatsoever for such an assertion, all of a sudden the LGBTQ movement takes on a little bit of a sinister tone that we were assured was only in our imaginations. Given that we are not born with a particular sexual orientation, but that it is developed by a myriad number of factors. We've not been born that way, so now the flood of pro-LGBTQ materials in our schools and across our culture, in movies and in advertising, all of a sudden that wave of propaganda begins to look less like an effort to help children accept their true identity, and it's beginning to look more and more like a recruiting effort. Further, if we're not born this way, then the enormous increase in the numbers of children and teens who are today identifying as transgender truly is a social contagion. We have young women, at least some girls, who are having their breasts removed, amputated body parts. We have young men, at least some boys, who are being castrated because of this superstitious panic that imagines that children can be born into the wrong bodies. This is obvious to anybody that's paying attention, yet the LGBTQ movement and its allies, whether the Democratic Party leadership or the Hollywood elite, they have all doubled down on this idea that we should not only provide but encourage chemically and surgically mutilating our children. Coaston, the writer of the New York Times article, pretends that she's confused by the objections of the rest of us, that we're somehow alarmed, not that they exist, but there's just so many of them that it's starting to make us uncomfortable. She has a stupid response to this argument by saying, there is no maximum number of people on earth who can be trans before we face civilizational ruin or planetary collapse. Well, that's a nifty statement. There's no number that we need to be concerned about that we reach someday and then disaster occurs, except that's a lie on the face of it. Because any movement that is marked by what we might call self-sterilization and the LGBTQ agenda, by definition, self-sterilizes. Women with women, men with men. If the movement gets to a significant enough size within a national culture, it will be the civilizational ruin of that culture, because the culture can't even have a birth rate that sustains its reproduction. The New York Times reporter has to be evasive because she knows that the movement is built on a lie and that it is now breaking the promises that the movement made to the rest of us in order to secure support from ordinary Americans. Don't you remember the falsehood that the rainbow identities are somehow intrinsic, that they were born this way? And we were told that because these are immutable, innate characteristics that come from birth, that it's essential for us to allow people to explore the coming out of their true identity. We were told that the result of that would be harmless. Don't you remember people saying, well, how will it hurt you if your gay neighbors get married. Or if Steve becomes Eve, or Aaron becomes Eric, how does that hurt you? Well, it turns out that the research shows us that the LGBTQ movement hurts people in quite a few ways. From efforts to compel the participation of opponents in same-sex marriage ceremonies and transgender pronoun rituals, to putting men in women's sports, in women's prisons, and in women's locker rooms. But I tell you what's really started to wake up our culture, and that is that now the rainbow lobby seems to be coming for our children. The lie of born this way has been used to justify exposing children at ever younger ages to sexual material and teaching them about gender ideology at an ever younger age so that they can discover their true selves. The article waves away any problem with that idea, but because we now know that we were born this way is a lie, all of a sudden this push for information to children as young as 4 and 5 years old, turns out they are not looking out for the best interests of children. Seems to me clear that they are recruiting children for an identity in an ideological movement. Public schools in some states are secretly transitioning children without parental consent. Some states, like California, are now stripping parental rights away from parents who are perceived as insufficiently affirming of the identities that their children have been propagandized into believing. They're doing this in America even as we watch Europe backtracking. European nations are stepping away from transitioning children. They've gone down that road. They're ahead of us, and they've seen the brick wall at the end of that road. Now they're pulling back. Not only do we see Europe going in the opposite direction from the U.S., but now we're beginning to see that children who were transitioned through medical treatment at early ages are now becoming adults, and there is an increasing flood of medical malpractice lawsuits that have begun rolling in from those who are detransitioning and yet can't recover from the irrevocable damage that's been done to their bodies and their endocrine systems. Turns out parents don't want their daughters shot full of testosterone. They don't want their sons chemically castrated, and they have realized that the excuses for doing so, that their children were born into the wrong bodies and must be medically transitioned before they kill themselves, turns out those were lies all along. You have to let them transition or they'll be suicidal. Do you know that the suicide attempt rate within the transgender community right now, you won't hear this in the mainstream media, the suicide attempt rate is at 41%. 4 out of 10 in the transgender community attempt suicide. But here's the thing. They've been promised that they'll find fulfillment, they'll find contentment. Only the vast majority of those suicide attempts come after their gender transition, when they realize that nothing is different and they're still as unhappy and as unstable as they ever were. Only now, because this didn't do what they were told it would do, now they're suicidal because they have the idea in their head that there's no hope. Biblically speaking, the prophet Isaiah talked about a culture that had lost its way. See if these verses don't sound familiar. In Isaiah chapter 59, beginning in verse 7, the prophet says, speaking about the culture at large, he says, "Their feet run to evil, and they hurry to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of wrongdoing. Devastation and destruction are in their paths. They do not know the way of peace, and there's no justice in their tracks. They've made their paths crooked. Whoever walks on them does not know peace." And then he drops down a little later in the chapter, and he says this about that culture that doesn't know truth. Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away. For truth has stumbled in the street, and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and one who turns aside from evil makes himself a prey. Now the Lord saw, and it was displeasing in his sight that there was no justice. That's an interesting phrase in verse 14. Truth has stumbled in the street, and uprightness cannot enter. We have built an entire culture based on a lie. Unfortunately, it's now clear that the people who started the party line, they knew they were lying to us right up front. It is not loving to affirm a person who lives in a lie. It's not healthy. It's not spiritually safe. Now, we have to do it with gentleness and compassion, but we need to be a people of truth, and we need to gently and kindly, but firmly tell people the truth. We are so desperate to be kind and loving that we often have said, whatever makes you happy is fine. The problem is we're discovering now by statistical evidence that this lie does not produce the happiness that we were promised. And in fact, this slippery slope does hurt society, but it hurts society because it is literally killing individuals. Do not buy that party line. It is pure propaganda. God created male and female, both in the image of God. It is loving and helpful to have conversations that point people lovingly and gently to truth, because we live in a culture where truth has stumbled in the street. And it's time for some of us to pick up truth and represent it in a way that invites people out of their despair, away from their suicidal disappointment, and help them to discover that their identity is not something tacked onto them like a bumper sticker, but it is the essence of who God made them to be, and nothing about them is a mistake. God has good plans for everyone that He's created. Let us bring truth back. Let us call a lie, and let us be a people who redeem the culture around us with truth and grace. This is Truth Currents.